Welcome to the great seaside city of Brighton, one of Britain's favourite coastal resorts, and today, one of the liveliest, coolest cities in the country. Over the course of this bumper hour-long tour of Brighton, we'll walk along the city's iconic seafront, stroll through a network of atmospheric, narrow lanes, and see the sights and uncover the history of some of Brighton's most spectacular landmarks. But there are few landmarks which embody Brighton's history and fame quite as well as this: Brighton Pier. Officially known as Brighton Palace Pier, this is the symbol of Brighton's famous history as a seaside resort. Built in 1899, Brighton Pier is one of the most popular attractions when beside the seaside, giving visitors strolling along the city's grand streets a chance to look out over Brighton's spectacular seafront and to enjoy a wide range of amusements. While the wide open promenade that we see here is today a bustling place with a collection of modern attractions itself, Brighton Palace Pier was one of the ultimate destinations for travellers to Brighton at the turn of the 20th century. Within just a few years of its opening, this pier had become a roaring success, then complete with a tram that ran from the shore here all the way down to a famous theatre which played host to acts including Stan Laurel of Laurel and Hardy, and even Charlie Chaplin, early on in their comedy careers. The pier is much changed today, however, with the historic theatre having been demolished in the late 1980s, and since replaced by a massive theme park full of roller coasters at the very end of the pier, while the rest of the boardwalk is home to arcades, eateries, and much more. But despite all that development and evolution, the pier still retains the atmosphere of the era in which it was built. Jutting over 1,700 feet or 500 metres out into the English Channel, the Palace Pier is a symbol of how Brighton, once a small coastal village, grew into one of the country's most famous seaside destinations. Brighton's iconic Pebble Beach now stands beneath a row of seafront buildings from a range of different eras, some being Victorian hotels, and some being rather more modern entertainment facilities. This pier, meanwhile, is the last remaining of what were once three different major piers that lined Brighton's bustling seafront. The first was the Royal Suspension Chain Pier, built in 1823, and which originally served more as a landing jetty for arriving boats than for entertainment like the Palace Pier. However, the Chain Pier was destroyed in 1896, and so the Palace Pier here was built instead. In the Victorian period, the Chain Pier was also neighboured further down the beach by the West Pier, opened in 1866, and which was once one of the most famous piers in all of England, attracting millions of visitors every year by the early 20th century. However, the West Pier was closed in 1975, and fell into disrepair over the following decades. Its dilapidated remains can still be seen from Brighton Beach though, and we'll get a look at that towards the end of our walk today. But as we make our way along the seafront now, we're passing by one of Brighton's earliest coastal hotels, the Royal Albion, which had its grand opening back in 1826. With 195 rooms, the Royal Albion is still in operation today, and it was one of the first places to accommodate the increasingly large numbers of tourists who were coming to stay in Brighton. But until the Georgian and Victorian eras, Brighton was a fairly normal coastal town, lined with small fishing boats and a menagerie of fishing huts. So why exactly were people so keen to come and holiday here? To understand, we need to take a look at exactly where in England Brighton is located. As you can see from this map, Brighton lies on England's south coast in the county of East Sussex, and importantly, it lies just 47 miles south of London. Brighton's proximity to London is arguably the most significant reason for its enduring success as a famous seaside resort. Ever since the early 18th century, Londoners have been making their way to Brighton to get a break from the hectic capital city, and to take in a bit of fresh sea air. It's because of that history that Brighton has often been nicknamed London by the Sea, a moniker that endures even today as Brighton retains its status as a desirable place to live. When Brighton initially emerged as a popular seaside destination around the 1730s, it was mainly visited by London's wealthiest as a health resort, as the concept of taking the waters by the sea was seen by many at the time to have great health benefits. This morphed into a pure leisure resort by the end of the 19th century. But before all of this tourism developed over the last 300 years or so, Brighton was little more than a humble fishing settlement. In the medieval era, the shore here was lined with small fishermen's huts and boats, with nets and ropes scattered across the pebbles. In the 14th century, Brighton's fishing industry did give rise to a small daily fish market held on the beach, and through the medieval era, it did develop into a fairly busy, albeit still small town. The problem, however, was that Brighton's position on England's exposed south coast left it vulnerable to foreign attackers, and so proved the case in the year 1514, when a French naval force burned the little town of Brighton to the ground. As we can see though, Brighton would rise again, into the seaside metropolis that's home to nearly 300,000 people today. Of course, not all of those 300,000 people live overlooking the sea, and so we'll now make our way away from the waterfront into the busy heart of Brighton. The sprawling modern city is hidden behind seafront buildings like the Queen's Hotel here, another huge hotel built in the Victorian era, more specifically in 1846. Once upon a time, the hotel was the site of the old Dolphin Inn pub, which stood at the very edge of an old town full of dark and narrow winding lanes. Walking past the Queen's Hotel, we now find ourselves on East Street, which is shrouded in shadow on this sunny morning by the towering buildings that surround it. East Street, as the name suggests, forms the easternmost boundary of what was once Brighton's Old Town, and has historically been one of the main routes from the northern, inland edge of Brighton down to the sea, along with the larger middle and west streets that also exist today. Lined with a colourful array of shops, East Street is a popular place to take a stroll away from the beach, but it's also where you'll find one of the most famous sites in Brighton's pop culture sphere, the Quadrophenia Alley. The alley, which you can see to the left of this Quadrophenia-themed shop, famously appears in the 1979 film from which it takes its name. The movie, an enduring symbol of fashionable Brighton, is based on a rock opera by legendary rock band The Who, and tells the story of the warring mods and rockers in the early 1960s, two factions of London youths who would often make their way down to Brighton here. The mods were fans of modern jazz and soul, wore sharp tailor-made suits, and rode stylish Vespa or Lambretta scooters. The rockers, meanwhile, were fans of American rock and roll, wore leather jackets, and rode big, powerful motorcycles on their days out of London. Though split by their tastes in fashion and music, real tensions ran deep between the mods and rockers. Most infamously, on a busy bank holiday weekend in May 1964, over 1,000 mods and rockers clashed on Brighton Beach, in a violent confrontation of flying pebbles and fisticuffs that has come to symbolise their legendary rivalry. Here, meanwhile, we're passing by a symbol of 19th century Brighton, the beautiful town hall, built in 1832. Constructed on the site of an old medieval priory, later a local marketplace, this huge Greek-style town hall demonstrates just how large Brighton was growing as the Victorian period rolled around, and how the old town here became dominated by imposing new architecture. But this part of the old town was always an important part in the commercial sphere of a pre-seaside resort Brighton. While the beach was the historic site of Brighton's traditional fish market, these few streets became the home of a group of markets selling a variety of different products. By the late 16th century, Brighton had recovered from being burned down by the French, and existed as a modestly sized market town. These few streets then found themselves as the busy heart of trade in Brighton, with everything from meat to dairy, textiles, fruit and more sold around here. This gave rise to a small boom in development before the influx of tourism that came to Brighton, as buildings that came to be used as inns and taverns, like the Pump House here, were constructed on the narrow lanes of what is today known as the Old Town. Here we find ourselves on Market Street, so named as it led towards the site of the Town Hall, where Brighton's main market was held in the 18th century. Throughout the century, the market spread out across these streets, with Market Street here becoming the home of rows of meat and dairy stalls. Today, it's one of a number of characterful streets lined with shops and cafes, which make up the bustling heart of Brighton that we can see even early in the morning today. But this part of Brighton is also famed as one of the most popular attractions in the modern city, home to the Lanes, a collection of atmospheric medieval lanes that are truly unique among the grand streets that were built around Brighton as it became a tourist hotspot. You'll immediately have noticed how we've become hemmed in with shops built just a few feet apart from each other, with a maze of claustrophobic alleyways roughly following the layout of some of Brighton's oldest streets. Nowadays, the lanes are well known for their many boutique shops, selling trinkets, antiques and jewellery, and they can get pretty packed at the height of the tourist season. It's thought that the lanes have existed ever since Brighton's early years, when it was the small village of Brighthelm. However, the lanes that we know today are mostly a product of the late 18th century, laid out and filled with shops in response to Brighton's rise as an upmarket seaside resort. The rise of Brighton's popularity among the wealthy came after the Prince Regent, later King George IV, built the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, which brought jobs for the locals of Brighton. And with ever more wealthy, fashionable individuals coming to holiday in Brighton, many locals who were making a living in fishing or simple market trading spotted an opportunity. They decided to play to the tastes of the London elite by setting up antique shops on these stylish lanes. Antique shops then became the beating heart of the lanes, dominating this part of Brighton right up to the 1960s. Today, jewellers have overtaken antique shops as the main presence in the lanes, but even without popping into one of these minute shops, you can feel the history of Brighton pervading through these atmospheric alleyways. The lanes have been a major attraction for visitors to Brighton for centuries, from Victorian elites perusing these historic antique shops, to modern-day tourists taking in a part of Brighton reminiscent of its captivating past. But given their continued role as a tourist attraction, the lanes are still ever-changing. Some of the oldest buildings date from as far back as the 17th century, but you'll also find much larger new buildings, some daubed with eye-catching murals characteristic of modern-day Brighton. This mural depicts Alice of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, whose author Lewis Carroll would often holiday down here in Brighton. But as we've mentioned, Carroll wasn't the only famous figure who regularly visited Brighton to take the waters. The Prince Regent, later King George IV, was attracted to Brighton as it gained notoriety as an upmarket health resort. Such was the Prince Regent's love for Brighton, he had the spectacular Royal Pavilion built as a holiday residence, located just a few hundred yards back from the seafront. We'll make our way to the Royal Pavilion now, but the Prince Regent didn't take the same route as us through the lanes on his way to the sea. In fact, beneath the lanes, you'll find a network of secret underground tunnels, which the Prince Regent used as a way to privately access Brighton Beach and the sea, without being mobbed as he tried to battle through the thronging streets. Here, we find ourselves on the busy North Street, historically the northern boundary of the original fishing village of Brighthelm. Today, it's an important thoroughfare through the middle of the city, on which we find the Chapel Royal, an impressive landmark built in 1795. As the name suggests, the chapel was built with the intention of being a place of worship for the Prince Regent, However, the prince only attended a few times, before ultimately boycotting the chapel after a seemingly objectionable sermon given there. The rest of North Street, meanwhile, has historically been known as a home of Brighton's commercial sphere, with many of the buildings here once occupied by large banks, including this beautiful pink-coloured building, which was once the home of the Leeds Permanent Building Society. But back in the medieval era, the street was lined with fields and barns, as it stood on the edge of the former village. The reason that North Street then went on to become such an important commercial centre was that the street is the main road in the city centre on which traffic to and from London would pass through Brighton. As the tourist trade began to explode at the turn of the 20th century, North Street became ever busier with traffic. So, it was widened and redeveloped, and it's now home to more shops than banks, as Brighton has continued to develop in the 21st century as a shopping paradise. Today, Brighton, and Hove, is of course the largest settlement in East Sussex, or in fact in all of Sussex, attracting visitors from all across the county. But while many visit to simply stroll along the sea and relax on the pebbles of Brighton Beach, you can find some truly spectacular landmarks in Brighton, and just ahead, we can see the entrance to the Brighton Pavilion, the Prince Regent's famous home. But who exactly was the Prince Regent, and why is he so associated with Brighton? Well, as we've mentioned, he later went on to become King George IV, reigning for 10 years between 1820 and 1830. But it was in the period before he rose to the throne that the Prince Regent began his association with Brighton. Always known for conducting a lavish lifestyle of wealth and excess, the Prince Regent was attracted to the fashionable, upmarket resort of Brighton, visiting for the first time in 1783. So enamoured with Brighton, he planned an extravagant palace to be built for him by the seaside, the Royal Pavilion, which was built over 36 years, from 1787 to 1823. As you can see though, the Royal Pavilion is no typical British royal residence. Designed by the architect John Nash, this gorgeous building is inspired by an architectural trend that was most common across the Indian subcontinent during the days of the British Empire. Some people call the Royal Pavilion Brighton's own Taj Mahal, and it's certainly one of the most recognisable landmarks in all of Britain. But as we look towards the iconic palace from its beautiful gardens here, you'll likely be aware that the royal family no longer spend their seaside holidays here. After George IV died, his successor, William IV, also spent time at the pavilion, as it served as the official royal residence by the sea. But the next monarch, Queen Victoria, was never particularly fond of Brighton nor the pavilion. During the early years of her reign, the railways arrived in Brighton, opening the seaside up to the masses, who flocked to the coast here from London. In Victoria's eyes, this made Brighton a rather less private place to holiday, as she inevitably attracted constant attention from punters. So, in 1850, she decided to switch the royal seaside residence to the far more secluded Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, selling off the Royal Pavilion to Brighton, who have ever since operated it as a popular tourist attraction. The pavilion is surrounded by beautifully tended gardens, which are home to an array of plants from all over the world, and where we can also see the rear of the grand Brighton Dome, which we'll talk more about in a little while. Since the Royal Pavilion was sold to Brighton, it's taken on a wide range of roles. The royals took many of the ornate fixtures and fittings with them to Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. Nowadays, though, it's open to visitors to stroll through its ornate palatial rooms, which have been restored to their state as they were during the time of the Prince Regent. However, back in the First World War, Brighton's Royal Pavilion was also used as a huge military hospital, treating wounded soldiers of the Indian Army during the first 2 years of the war. The gateway that we walked through to enter the pavilion from North Street was then built in 1921, in recognition of the pavilion's time as a military hospital. The effort to restore the interior of the pavilion to its Regency heyday has been ongoing pretty much ever since the end of the First World War, with the royal family having returned many of its original decorations that had been used at Buckingham Palace. Taking a walk through the pavilion is just as beautiful as exploring its gorgeous gardens here, particularly as the sun shines over Brighton on this wonderful morning. But at the edge of the gardens, we find another gateway that takes us away from the Royal Pavilion. This is the North Gate, which was built in 1832, currently undergoing restoration. Built during the short 7-year reign of William IV, the North Gate is nearly 90 years older than the India Gate, which we walked through a few moments ago, and which served as the first glimpse of the famed Royal Pavilion for visitors who were approaching Brighton from the north. In 1837, when Queen Victoria ascended to the throne, the North Gate was also surrounded by a huge temporary amphitheatre, shown in this image, through which Victoria arrived at the pavilion on her first visit to Brighton as Queen. Sadly, despite the warm welcome, Victoria and Brighton's relationship wasn't all roses, and she vacated the pavilion just 13 years after that grand day. Now out of the pavilion's grounds, we find ourselves on Church Street, where we find the famous Brighton Dome, which we saw from the rear in the Pavilion Gardens. Composed of 3 buildings, the Concert Hall, the Corn Exchange, and the Studio Theatre, the Brighton Dome was originally commissioned to be used as a stables by the Prince Regent, where 44 of his horses were kept. The dome was sold off along with the pavilion by Queen Victoria, after which point it was used as an assembly hall, another military hospital in World War I, and then most famously, a concert venue. The Brighton Dome has played host to countless famous acts over the years, but in 1974 it was the host of the Eurovision Song Contest, in which a certain Swedish act named ABBA won for their song Waterloo. I wonder whatever happened to them. The Eurovision Song Contest was held in the Brighton Dome's Concert Hall, and funnily enough, the Wombles were the interval performance that year. Along with the Concert Hall, the Brighton Dome complex is also home to the Corn Exchange, originally built as the riding school for the Prince Regent, with his horses kept next door in the Concert Hall. This part of the dome takes its name from the use it took on from 1868, when Brighton took over operations of the former royal facility. It became the town's corn exchange, where corn and grains were bought and sold, and remained so until 1914. Down this street on our left, meanwhile, you'll also find the Studio Theatre, the third and smallest part of the Brighton Dome complex. Altogether, the 3 buildings make up the city's premier arts venue today, standing at the heart of the city's bustling cultural quarter. We're now about 1/3 of a mile away from the seafront, and we're approaching a part of Brighton that's especially well known among the city's youth. Brighton has long been famous as an attractive place for free-thinking, hip young people to visit or even set up shop, from as long ago as the days of the mods and rockers to the diverse population of the city today. And while the seafront area of Brighton is the first destination for visitors who look to relax under the sun, many people who travel to Brighton come exclusively to tour the city's famous Bohemian district, known as North Laine. North Laine, made up of about 4 blocks covering half a square mile of the city, is home to hundreds of independent, offbeat shops, cafes, galleries and more, and it makes up arguably the most vibrant, eclectic part of the city. Here we find ourselves on Gardner Street, one of the main roads in the North Laine district, which is absolutely bursting with colour, from the bunting up above to the beautiful painted shop fronts that line the street. You'll find a shop for almost any persuasion in the North Laine area, each one quirkier than the last. But as well as the district's many shops, here we're passing by Komedia, one of Brighton's most famous comedy clubs, which opened here on Gardner Street in 1998, taking over what was once a Tesco supermarket. In keeping with the trendy characteristics of the North Laine area, an art house cinema named Duke's was also opened inside Komedia back in 2012, giving visitors on a night out in this part of Brighton plenty to do even after the shops have closed. Now, Gardner Street, although spiritually part of the North Laine area, is actually located just outside the geographical district, and this street acts more as an entrance that gears you up for the most labyrinthine shopping lanes to come in the heart of North Laine. But how exactly did North Laine come to be the beating heart of trendy Brighton? Well, the area has only emerged as the city's so-called Bohemian district in the last couple of decades of the 20th century, after North Laine was threatened with demolition in the 60s and 70s. Long before then, however, this area was covered in fields that lay on the outskirts of the old town of Brighthelm. One of those fields was named North Laine, spelt Laine, a local word referring to an open area of land. The fields of North Laine were used for farming from the medieval era all the way up until the early 19th century, but the boom in tourism that came with the era, followed up by the opening of Brighton railway station on the doorstep of North Laine, caused buildings and streets to be laid out over what was once open farmland. The narrow grid-pattern streets that make up North Laine today were laid out roughly in line with the old dirt tracks that separated different plots, and new houses were built tightly packed together along them. Here we now find ourselves on one of the most famously narrow streets in all of North Laine, Kensington Gardens, which was originally laid out in 1808 and home to small houses with even smaller gardens. Nowadays, you'll notice that Kensington Gardens is a delightfully hectic market-style shopping street, with shop awnings and outdoor stalls making an already narrow street as tight as can be. For many, Kensington Gardens is the most attractive of all the streets on North Laine, allowing you to peruse a range of different shops, or to sit down in one of its cafes or alehouses. But back in the 19th century, when the street was first laid out, it was far from the most attractive place in Brighton. In fact, the entire North Laine area was known for its squalor, with terraced houses crammed onto small streets like this, and the area home to a high density of particularly pungent slaughterhouses. Slaughterhouses were just one of the many food processing facilities that came to dominate these streets in the Victorian period, producing food for Brighton's rapidly ballooning population. In contrast to the famously well-kept seafront and boutique lanes area in the old town, North Laine was never on a tourist's itinerary for a day out in Brighton. North Laine remained a notorious slum until the 1870s, when a first round of slum clearance tidied the area up a little. However, North Laine was still a heavily industrial area, and it fell on hard times after the Second World War, becoming relatively run down and threatened with demolition. The council in the 1960s planned to replace the streets of North Laine with big, concrete high-rises, but thankfully, a man by the name of Ken Fiennes, the borough planning officer, saved the day, as he saw potential for the North Laine area. In 1977, North Laine became a conservation area, and it has since developed into the hip district we know today. Having now made our way through the busy Kensington Gardens, we've arrived onto Sydney Street, another of the most popular streets in North Laine, which typically specialises in the sale of comic books and vinyl records. Also famed for a number of shops painted with spectacular, colourful murals, Sydney Street has since 1845 made a living through shopping. The buildings that line the street here have had countless uses over the years, but when North Lane was a cramped residential area in the 19th and early 20th centuries, these now trendy shops provided a wide range of goods and services to locals, with everything from carpenters to watchmakers, greengrocers, pubs, cobblers, and at one point even a straw bonnet maker, all having existed along the street. In the mid-20th century, meanwhile, Sydney Street became known for a high density of butchers, with the street playing host to popular weekly meat auctions on Saturday afternoons. By the 1970s, the emergence of supermarkets soon put an end to the traditional food stores that existed along Sydney Street, and after it was saved from demolition, this street became one of the first to shift gears towards the quirky local economy that defines the city to many people today. The people of Brighton are certainly proud of the quirky, trendy North Lane area, not only beloved for its endless labyrinth of brightly coloured buildings daubed with offbeat murals, but also for the free-thinking atmosphere that it conjures up. Having been saved from being decimated and replaced by tower blocks, North Lane is a real treasure to behold in Brighton city centre, with independent shops that you'll struggle to find in almost any other city or town in the country. North Lane acts as a microcosm for Brighton's legendary ability to attract an eclectic range of people from all walks of life. Brighton is among the most open-minded and diverse cities in the entire country, notable for its wide range of vegetarian and vegan restaurants, a vibrant artistic community, and a long history as the unofficial gay capital of the UK. Brighton is home to one of the largest LGBT communities in Britain, and each year hosts the country's largest Pride Festival in the Kemp Town area of the city, located just to the east of the Old Town. Held since 1972, Brighton Pride is a major event in the city's calendar, and as many as 500,000 people descend on Brighton to take part in the festivities. Brighton's status as the nation's gay capital is a long-standing point of pride for the city. But how did Brighton become so popular with the gay community? Well, like so much of the history we've explored so far, it all goes back to the 19th century, and the development of easy links from London to the seaside here. While hundreds and thousands of people flocked from London to Brighton, the nearest seaside resort to the capital, Brighton was always a haven for people looking to escape their busy, high-pressure lives in London. As such, many gay people who were at the time unable to openly express their sexuality appreciated the relative anonymity that an escape to Brighton brought. From the late 19th to the early 20th century, word began to spread among a still largely hidden gay community in London that Brighton was the place to be, as a more tolerant and open locale. It was in the 1930s then that Brighton's gay community really began to flourish, with the opening of numerous gay and lesbian pubs in Kemp Town and elsewhere. And after the Second World War, Brighton's gay scene really began to cement itself as a proud part of the city, which persists to this day. Now, you'll notice that we've been walking up a sloping road, which leads us out of North Lane towards one of the main streets that run through the centre of Brighton. The rise in the terrain here is because we're walking up what was historically a small chalk ridge, part of the chalk-heavy coastline that runs along the English Channel here. Centuries ago, Brighton developed in the area around the Old Town and near where the Palace Pier is today, as a small seasonal stream flowed by out to sea, providing a fresh water source for locals who established the fishing village behind Brighton's famous beach. As the centuries went by and with the exponential growth of Brighton's population come the 19th century, the farms that once occupied this area began to make way for housing, built across the rolling chalk ridge that forms one of the highest points of the city centre today. And if you're visiting Brighton by train, like so many of the tourists who have come to this city for a day by the sea, then it's this street, Queen's Road, and this part of the city that you'll first encounter, as it's home to Brighton's historic railway station. Set among a bustling node of the modern city just up ahead, the railway station is arguably the most important building in all of Brighton, as its opening transformed the seaside town from an exclusive, upmarket retreat to a massive seaside resort accessible to almost anyone. The station opened in 1840, and it wasn't long before the masses began descending on the historically exclusive seaside sphere at Brighton. In particular, many people were attracted by Brighton's royal connections, and the chance to see Queen Victoria herself at the Pavilion or even by the sea. Of course, we know what Queen Victoria thought of all that attention from these newcomers to Brighton, but whilst she fled to the Isle of Wight, trains just kept bringing more and more people here. The influx of London tourists to Brighton by rail was expected when the station was built. As you can see from this illustration of 1841, the station was a huge 3-storey building that stood among an otherwise undeveloped area on the edge of Brighton. Things certainly look different today, and so does the station, with the addition of a spectacular glass roof that covers its 8 long platforms. On busy summer days, the station can be absolutely packed, with services today running not only along the Brighton main line between here and London, but also along the coast to the likes of Portsmouth, Southampton and Hastings. Once upon a time, you could even catch the train from Brighton as far away as Bristol or even Birmingham, but while those services are no longer in operation, this seaside city is fantastically easy to get to, wherever you're coming from. But as we now make our way down Queen's Road back towards the seafront, there's something very important about this city that often gets overlooked. Once a seaside town, Brighton is now one of the largest cities in southern England, except it's not just Brighton that holds city status. Gaining city status in the year 2000, the former town of Brighton has linked up with the neighbouring town of Hove, which lies to the west of central Brighton here. Together, they make up the city of Brighton and Hove, a large settlement that's becoming ever more integrated as the years go by. By population, Brighton is about 3 times the size of Hove, but the two areas share a similar history. Hove was once a small fishing village a few miles away from Brighthelmstone, and it only had 101 inhabitants in the year 1801. However, the boom in Brighton during the 19th century spilled over into its neighbour Hove, although it became popular for rather more illicit pastimes. While the rich and famous paraded the streets of Brighton, Hove became a notorious hive of smugglers, who dealt foreign contraband just out of the gaze of those in Brighton. This remained the case until the 1830s, but Hove later went on to grow to a modest size on the coattails of Brighton's huge development in the Victorian era, though it's still often overshadowed by its more famous neighbour. In fact, Hove is sometimes known to its residents as Hove actually, a local jokey slogan which comes from people asking, "Do you live in Brighton?" To which Hove locals respond, "Yes, well, Hove actually." We won't quite have the time to walk all the way into Hove on this sunny morning, but we're now making our way down Queen's Road, a slightly more modern thoroughfare that links Brighton's seafront with the railway station. While the old town streets of East Street, Ship Street and West Street can trace their origins back to the medieval era, Queen's Road here was laid out rather more recently, in 1845, designed simply to ease access between the station and the old town and beach. As a wider street than any of the city's oldest main roads, Queen's Road is one of the busiest central thoroughfares in Brighton today, lying just to the west of the original town settlement, higher up on the chalk ridge that we mentioned a few moments ago. When the street was laid out in the mid-19th century, it quickly became filled with buildings, many of which were hospitals and other medical facilities. Over time, however, hotels and shops began to take over Queen's Road, which was well known among Brighton locals in the 1970s as the home of one of the first Virgin Record stores in the country, located a little further down the road towards the sea. On our left, meanwhile, we're passing by the Brighthelm Gardens, which give us a clue as to what once existed here before Queen's Road. Once upon a time, the gardens were one of the oldest cemeteries in Brighton, acting as a burial ground from the 18th century, and which later became associated with the old Hanover chapel, which still stands beside the gardens today. Even among what is undoubtedly one of the more modern sectors of Brighton city centre, the old burial ground shows the long history of this area that stood outside the old town. And as we turn right off Queen's Road, just up this street, we'll find one of Brighton's oldest buildings of all, the historic parish church. Now, as you can see, we're already rising quite dramatically above the centre of Brighton, but we're still walking along Church Street, on which we saw the Brighton Dome a while ago. This end of Church Street, further away from the bustling heart of Brighton's cultural quarter, is home to an array of pleasant houses that overlook the city centre. But this quiet residential area, while located far away from the old heart of Brighton, is also located on the doorstep of the parish church of St. Nicholas, which stands on a site with a history dating back over 900 years. You'll notice, however, that the church in the churchyard beside us is located rather far away from Brighton's old town. So why were locals forced to walk so far to go to worship? The likelihood is that, positioned up on top of this hill, the church was a prominent landmark for locals when they were on land and when they were fishing out at sea. Plus, as the old village was often vulnerable to being attacked from the sea by French raiders, the church's position further back from the sea and higher up made it safer from a defensive perspective. And here we can now see St. Nicholas's Church, the current iteration of which dates at its oldest to the 14th century. An older chapel is thought to have stood here before then, but the clever positioning we've just talked about is the exact reason why this is one of the very few medieval buildings you'll find in Brighton today. Infamously, the village of Brighthelmstone was burned to the ground by French raiders in the year 1514. In the aftermath of that attack, this church was the only structure left standing, serving as a haven for the displaced villagers. Over its centuries of existence, however, this church has suffered a fair bit of wear and tear, suffering heavy damage in the Great Storm of 1703, while also being overwhelmed by the larger congregation that developed in Brighton at the end of the 18th century. St. Nicholas's was the only Anglican church in Brighton as the boom of the 19th century took hold, and so in 1853 it was mostly rebuilt to alleviate the heavy burden it had taken on as Brighton had exploded in size. That being said, while the rebuilding strengthened the historic church so that it should remain standing, its capacity was reduced as a result, and so by 1873, the newer and larger St. Peter's Church, closer to the residential heart of Brighton, became the town's new parish church. But St. Nicholas's is without a doubt the original mother church of Brighton, and if you're ever touring the city centre on a day out, a walk up to this relatively secluded part of the city makes for an interesting change from the busy seafront, even offering views across the city centre below. But let's now make our way from one of the highest points in Brighton all the way back down to the seafront, which we'll reach in just over 5 minutes' time. From there, we'll take another walk along the promenade, where we'll be able to see the burnt-out ruins of the old West Pier, the imposing Grand Hotel, and the characteristic pebbles of Brighton Beach. Before we get there, though, we'll make our way through more of the bustling heart of Brighton. Coming to the bottom of the slope here, we're now approaching one of the main shopping precincts in Brighton today. Contrary to the offbeat independent street you'll find in North Laine, this is where we'll find Brighton's principal shopping centre, known as Churchill Square. Situated on a busy intersection west of the Old Town, the current shopping centre was opened in 1998 and was a rebuild of a groundbreaking mall originally built in the 1960s. The building of Churchill Square was actually planned as far back as the 1930s, and it saw the removal of a group of historic 19th century streets. But while the mall may have taken the place of some historic streets, just a few steps away we see another famous landmark of Brighton, the Jubilee Clock Tower. Positioned on the busy junction of Queen's Road and North Street, the Jubilee Clock Tower has occupied a prominent spot in the city centre ever since 1888, when it was built to celebrate Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee the year before, her 50th anniversary on the throne. Along with its beautiful old clock face, the tower is complete with portraits of Queen Victoria and 3 of her closest royal family members. Meanwhile, at the top of the clock tower, you'll notice a spectacular golden ball, a time ball that's meant to rise and fall over the course of each hour during the day. The work of local inventor Magnus Volk, the time ball was actually deliberately turned off 14 years after the clock tower was built, because it made a noise that scared passing horses. In 2002, however, the year of Queen Elizabeth II's Golden Jubilee, it was put back into action, albeit still occasionally ceasing to work for various reasons. But while the time ball on the clock tower may not have been an enduring success, its creator Magnus Volk is still renowned in Brighton, albeit for another groundbreaking invention that's actually still working down by the seaside. On the promenade near to Brighton Palace Pier, where we began our walk, you'll find Volk's Electric Railway, a popular tourist attraction that's actually the oldest operating electric railway in the entire world. The railway, which runs back and forth for just over a mile along one half of Brighton Beach, was opened all the way back in 1883, when steam trains were the dominant force on Britain and Europe's railways. Volk, who also had a brief foray into the world of electric cars, was best known for this electric railway, that has always served as a popular curiosity among visitors to the seafront. At the height of Brighton's popularity in the first half of the 20th century, Volk's electric railway was even longer, and operated all year round. However, like many seaside resorts around England, there was a post-war decline that saw a reduction in visitor numbers to Brighton, which forced the electric railway to move to an effective summer-only calendar. But from Easter until the beginning of November, you can still ride the VER today. As we get nearer to the sea, we're surrounded by everything from pubs to arcades, shops and restaurants. But here on West Street, we also find the towering St Paul's Church, which rather sticks out in this part of the city centre. This impressive church dates from 1848, though it stands on the site of a slightly older chapel that was used by local fishermen in the early 19th century. The church is popularly known as the Fishermen's Church, as when it was built, the area around it was the home of many fishermen, who lived in small, poor houses, much different to the grand lodgings of those at the Pavilion just a few streets away. St Paul's is one of the oldest buildings in this part of the city, and it also managed to escape unscathed from one of the most dangerous periods in Brighton's recent history, the Second World War. As we've spoken about, Brighton's position on England's south coast, complete with a wide-open pebble beach, has meant that it's always been vulnerable to attack from across the English Channel. And in 1940, when France had fallen to the Nazis and Hitler was looking across towards Britain, it was feared the same could happen again. So, to protect against an amphibious invasion of Britain landing on Brighton Beach, all of the town's beaches were closed every day after 5 o'clock in the afternoon, while much of the decking from both the Palace Pier and the Old West Pier was removed, so that any invading force couldn't use the piers as landing jetties. The threat of an invasion in Brighton appeared to be very real, and as many as 30,000 people were evacuated from the town in 1940 in preparation. Now, as you'll know, that invasion never came, but Brighton did still suffer heavily during the war, falling victim to the Brighton Blitz, where the Luftwaffe launched 56 air raids on the town and the surrounding area from 1940 until 1944, which caused the deaths of almost 200 locals. But as we make our way back out onto the seafront, the Second World War wasn't the first time it was feared Brighton would be the site of an invasion of Britain. In fact, Brighton had been preparing for war as far back as the 1790s, with the North Laine area home to a number of army bases and barracks. In 1792, revolutionary France declared war on Great Britain, prompting the army to immediately shore up its defences on the south coast here. Brighton, which had already begun to develop as a busy resort town, was an ideal place to station troops. Fears of a French invasion of Britain were raised during the Napoleonic Wars of 1803 to 1815, but ultimately, no invasion ever came along. So as we look over the peaceful beach as it begins to fill with sunbathers and swimmers, Brighton managed to avoid the fate it suffered at the hands of raiders 500 years ago, avoiding any invasion from this beach on 2 significant occasions. But in the 1980s, this sunny, lively part of Brighton would fall victim to one of the most devastating attacks on English soil in years. The huge cream-coloured building to our right is the Grand Brighton Hotel, built in 1864 for the wealthiest of the wealthy, who were coming to visit Brighton in the later Victorian period. Complete with spectacular balconies that offer stunning views of the sea, it's a notoriously expensive place to stay, but also a hotel that was involved in a major incident in 1984. In the early hours of the 12th of October that year, the Grand Hotel was ripped apart by a bomb, which had been planted by the IRA in an attempted assassination of then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and her cabinet, who were staying at the hotel during the Conservative Party conference being held in Brighton. Thatcher and most of her cabinet escaped the blast, although one MP, Sir Anthony Berry, was killed in the attack, along with 4 others connected to the Conservative Party. This image shows the aftermath of the bombing, with the beautiful Victorian hotel left with a gaping hole that remains the lasting image of a significant event during the Troubles conflict, and of Margaret Thatcher's premiership. Fortunately, the Grand was quickly restored to its former glory, and the hotel still stands resplendent as we can see today, one of the ultimate places to stay on a visit to Brighton. Now, while the balconies of some of the Grand Brighton Hotel's 201 rooms offer stunning views out to sea and over Brighton Beach, just a little further along the seafront, there's an even better way to get an uninterrupted panoramic view across Brighton. The big metal pole that we can see soaring into the sky ahead of us is one of the newest additions to Brighton's seafront and skyline, known as the I-360, which has been billed as a new vertical pier for Brighton. Built in 2016 by the same people behind the London Eye, this brand new observation tower stands 531 feet or 162 metres tall, along which a large glass pod ascends and descends every half hour. I haven't been up on the I-360 myself, though the views at the top must be stunning, especially on a sunny day like this. That being said, looking at the tower from down on the ground, its design is a little uninspired among Brighton's many spectacular buildings, but it offers yet another activity for visitors strolling up and down the city's beautiful promenade. Out in the water, we can see a more iconic landmark, the burnt-out remains of Brighton's Old West Pier, originally opened in 1866, and which closed down in 1975. We'll get a closer look at the remains of the pier when we walk out onto Brighton Beach in a few moments, but looking back towards the buildings of the seafront, Next to the Grand Hotel stands another rather grand hotel, the Brighton Metropole. Built in 1890, the Metropole has over 100 more rooms than its slightly older neighbour, but also stands proud with spectacular vistas out to sea over Brighton's famous beach. Brighton is well known for its more than 5-mile-long pebble beach, but many visitors to the city do often wonder, why isn't it sandy? Well, like many beaches on this part of the south coast, from Hastings to Eastbourne and more, Brighton's Pebble Beach, or more correctly Shingle Beach, is a product of the ground that lies beneath us. We mentioned earlier that Brighton is built on the edge of a small chalk ridge, chalk being the material that makes up the South Downs, which line this long part of the coast of southeast England. Typically, sandy beaches are created by sea waves eroding a rocky landscape, and breaking those rocks down into sand that's deposited along a coastline. As this coast is made up of chalk, however, there are fewer rocks for the sea to break down. The pebbles of Brighton Beach, then, are actually the product of flint found in the cliffs outside the city centre, and which gradually move along the coast to this point. To ensure the pebbles stay on the beach and don't get swept out to sea, the people of Brighton have built large stone groins, almost like small piers, that sit along the beach to capture pebbles and prevent Brighton Beach from becoming a muddy, silty wasteland. Continuing along the seafront, across from us we can see the impressive Regency Square, a beautiful development of the early 19th century that took over an old field and turned it into a prestigious, much sought after square, fronted by an imposing South African War Memorial of 1905. The development of Regency Square came about when Brighton was still a famously exclusive resort, and before the influx of mass tourism that came with the arrival of the railways in 1840. It was only after the arrival of mass tourism and the departure of Queen Victoria that the Brighton we know today really began to take shape. Where the I-360 stands was once the entry to the second pier built in Brighton, the famous West Pier. The entry to the I-360 even incorporates some of the old pier's entrance halls, which decades ago were thronging with visitors from all over the region looking to walk out over the water on one of Brighton's most famous landmarks. The wealthy residents of Regency Square just behind the pier actually objected to its construction, saying it would spoil the view. But its opening went ahead, and complete with a concert hall and theatre, later a tea room and restaurant, it served as a favourite destination for visitors for 89 years. The West Pier's eventual closure came in 1975, as it began to decay, and the cost of maintaining it in a safe state became too much. Since then, it stood empty out at sea, suffering gradually more damage after various storms and fires that have left it as a burnt-out shell. But I have to say, it's quite a striking landmark to look at out to sea. And so, as we stand on Brighton's famous beach looking over the sea, we've now reached the end of our walk in this spectacular seaside city. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to taking a day out to Brighton for yourself sometime soon.